The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base as Maya Chen shuffled through the communications center, her oversized utility uniform hanging loose on her small frame. At barely 5 feet tall, with wire-rimmed glasses perpetually sliding down her nose, she looked more like a college student who had wandered into the wrong building than someone who belonged among the elite warriors of Naval Special Warfare Group. 2. Her black hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that somehow managed to look perpetually messy, and her pale complexion suggested someone who spent more time indoors with computer screens than under the California sun. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She carried herself with the quiet resignation of someone who had grown accustomed to being overlooked, her shoulders slightly hunched as she made her way between the towering communications equipment. The other personnel barely acknowledged her presence as she began her daily routine of checking radio frequencies, updating encryption protocols, and ensuring the complex web of satellite communications remained operational. To everyone around, her Maya was simply part of the background infrastructure, as invisible and unremarkable as the humming servers that lined the walls. The SEAL teams preparing for their morning briefings paid her no attention whatsoever. These were men who commanded respect through their very presence, their confidence radiating from every measured step and controlled gesture. They moved with the fluid precision of apex predators, their conversations peppered with tactical terminology and references to operations that civilians could never comprehend. In contrast, Maya seemed to shrink further into herself whenever they entered her workspace, her eyes fixed firmly on her computer monitors, as if afraid that direct eye contact might somehow reveal her inadequacy. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Rodriguez had been stationed at the base for 3 years, and in all that time, he had never given Maya Chen more than a passing glance. She was simply another support technician, one of dozens of personnel who kept the complex machinery of special operations running smoothly behind the scenes. Her personnel file, if he had ever bothered to read it, would have told him she was 28 years old, had graduated from a modest state university with a degree in communications technology, and had been assigned to the base 18 months ago as a GS-7 civilian contractor. What the file would not have mentioned, because it was carefully omitted from all official records, was that Maya Chen was not her real name. The woman who quietly maintained radio equipment and updated software protocols had once been known by a very different identity, one that would have sent shockwaves through the special operations community if anyone had made the connection. But Maya had worked very hard to ensure that connection would never be made, crafting her new identity with the same meticulous attention to detail that had once made her legendary in very different circles. The morning routine at the communications center was predictable and comforting in its monotony. Maya would arrive precisely at 0600 hours, unlock her workstation, and begin the systematic process of checking overnight message traffic. She would update frequency allocations, test backup communication systems, and ensure that the encrypted channels used by deployed teams remained secure and functional. Her work was competent, but unremarkable, exactly the kind of steady, reliable performance that earned neither praise nor criticism from her supervisors. The other technicians in the center treated her with the casual indifference typically reserved for furniture or office supplies. They would exchange pleasantries about the weather or weekend plans, but Maya never contributed much to these conversations beyond polite nods and brief responses. She ate lunch alone at her desk, usually a simple sandwich brought from home, while reading technical manuals or scrolling through equipment specifications on her computer. To her colleagues, she appeared to be exactly what her cover identity suggested, a quiet, somewhat antisocial woman who had found her niche in the technical aspects of military communications. The physical demands of her job were minimal, which suited Maya's apparent lack of athletic ability perfectly. She struggled with the mandatory physical fitness assessments required of all base personnel, barely managing to complete the minimum requirements for her age group. During the quarterly training exercises, she would inevitably be assigned to administrative duties rather than field operations, a decision that seemed to suit everyone involved. The idea of Maya Chen participating in anything remotely resembling combat operations was so absurd that it never occurred to anyone to question her obvious limitations. Her living quarters off base were as unremarkable as her professional persona. A small apartment in a complex populated primarily by junior military personnel and civilian contractors, furnished with the kind of generic furniture that suggested someone who had never planned to stay in one place for very long. Her neighbors knew her as a quiet woman who kept to herself, paid her rent on time, and never caused any disturbances. The few personal items visible in her apartment suggested someone with interests in technical literature and classical music, hardly the profile of someone with a dangerous past. Maya's daily interactions with the SEAL teams were limited and carefully orchestrated to maintain her cover. When they needed communication support, she would provide it with professional competence, but without any display of tactical knowledge that might seem unusual for a civilian contractor. She would ask the appropriate questions about frequency, requirements, and encryption protocols, but never demonstrated any understanding of the operational context behind these technical specifications. Her responses were always helpful but revealed nothing about any deeper knowledge of special operations procedures or capabilities. The base's security protocols meant that Maya's background investigation had been thorough, but the identity she had constructed was sophisticated enough to withstand even careful scrutiny. Her educational records, employment history, and personal references all checked out because they were all genuine, carefully cultivated over several years of patient preparation. The woman who had once been known by a very different name had invested considerable time and resources in creating Maya Chen, and the result was a cover identity that would have impressed professional intelligence officers. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez's first real interaction with Maya came during a routine communications exercise that had gone wrong due to equipment failure. The primary satellite uplink had malfunctioned during a critical phase of the training operation, leaving an entire SEAL team effectively cut off from base support. Maya was working the overnight shift when the emergency arose, and she found herself alone in the communications center as frantic radio calls began coming in from the field. The standard protocol would have been to contact her supervisor and wait for senior technicians to address the problem, but Maya could hear the growing concern in the radio transmissions from the teams. Time was becoming a critical factor, and she realized that following normal procedures might result in a training exercise becoming a real emergency. Without hesitation, she began systematically working through the technical problems, her fingers flying across multiple keyboards as she accessed diagnostic systems and began rerouting communications through backup channels. What Rodriguez witnessed when he arrived at the communication center 20 minutes later was a transformation that defied explanation. The quiet, unremarkable technician who barely spoke above a whisper during normal operations was now orchestrating a complex technical recovery with calm professional efficiency. Her voice over the radio circuits was crisp and authoritative as she guided the field teams through frequency changes and communication protocols. She was simultaneously coordinating with satellite control facilities, managing multiple radio networks, and troubleshooting equipment problems that should have required a team of senior technicians to resolve. The most striking change was not in her technical capabilities, which were impressive, but could perhaps be explained by hidden competence, but in her demeanor. Maya was no longer the nervous, self-deprecating woman who seemed apologetic for her very existence. She had become someone who clearly expected her instructions to be followed without question, someone whose quiet confidence suggested extensive experience managing critical situations under pressure. Her posture had changed, Her voice had changed. And most remarkably, her entire presence had somehow expanded to fill the room with an authority that seemed to come from nowhere. Rodriguez stood in the doorway watching this transformation with growing bewilderment. He had commanded special operations teams for over a decade, and he recognized the signs of someone who had been trained to handle crisis situations. The woman, working at the communications console, was displaying exactly the kind of calm professionalism that he would expect from his most experienced operators, not from a civilian contractor whose primary qualification was supposed to be basic technical competence. Maya seemed completely absorbed in her work, her attention focused entirely on the multiple radio circuits and computer displays that she was managing simultaneously. She was speaking in the kind of shorthand tactical language that suggested intimate familiarity with special operations procedures, using terminology and concepts that civilian contractors were not supposed to understand. Her instructions to the field teams were precise and effective, demonstrating knowledge of communication protocols that should have been far beyond her security clearance level. The crisis was resolved within 45 minutes with all teams safely returned to base and communication systems restored to full functionality. Maya had somehow managed to identify and correct multiple system failures that should have required hours of work by specialized technicians. More importantly, she had done so while maintaining constant communication with the field teams, ensuring that what could have been a dangerous situation remained simply an inconvenient training problem. As the immediate crisis passed, Rodriguez noticed Maya beginning to transform back into her usual self. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The confident, authoritative presence that had filled the room began to fade as she completed her final radio checks and began shutting down the emergency protocols she had activated. Her shoulders resumed their characteristic slump, her voice dropped back to its normal quiet register, and the wire-rimmed glasses that had somehow remained perfectly positioned during the crisis began sliding down her nose once again. By the time Maya turned to acknowledge Rodriguez's presence, she had resumed the persona of the unremarkable support technician who seemed perpetually apologetic for existing. She gave him a brief, nervous smile and began explaining the technical problems that had occurred, her voice carrying the same hesitant quality that characterized all her normal interactions. It was as if the confident, capable woman who had managed the crisis had simply vanished, leaving behind only the familiar figure of someone who seemed surprised by her own competence. Rodriguez found himself studying Maya's face as she spoke, searching for some clue that might explain what he had witnessed. There was something about her eyes that seemed different now, a fleeting quality that suggested depths beneath the surface that she was working very hard to conceal. But when he tried to focus on that impression, it seemed to slip away, leaving him wondering if he had imagined the entire transformation. The technical explanation Maya provided for the equipment failures was comprehensive and accurate, but delivered in the same apologetic tone that suggested she was somehow responsible for problems that were clearly beyond her control. She seemed genuinely surprised when Rodriguez thanked her for her handling of the situation, as if the idea that her actions had been particularly noteworthy had never occurred to her. Her response was characteristic of someone who had grown accustomed to being overlooked and undervalued, someone whose contributions were so rarely acknowledged that praise seemed unexpected and slightly uncomfortable. As Rodriguez left the communications center, he found himself troubled by questions he could not quite articulate. The woman he had just watched handle a complex emergency with remarkable skill and composure did not seem to match the person who was now returning to her routine tasks with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her work for the past 18 months. There was a disconnect between the capabilities she had demonstrated and the identity she projected, but he could not identify any specific inconsistency that would justify his growing suspicions. The following days brought no immediate answers to Rodriguez's questions, but they did provide additional opportunities to observe Maya's behavior more carefully. He began finding excuses to visit the communication center during different shifts, ostensibly to check on equipment status or review message traffic, but actually to watch Maya work. What he discovered was a woman who seemed to have two completely different sets of capabilities that she could access depending on the circumstances. During routine operations, Maya remained the unremarkable technician who performed her duties competently but without any particular distinction. She followed standard procedures, asked appropriate questions when uncertain, and displayed exactly the level of technical knowledge that would be expected from someone with her supposed background and training. Her interactions with other personnel remained limited and professional, characterized by the same quiet deference that had defined her presence on the base since her arrival. However, Rodriguez began to notice subtle inconsistencies that suggested Maya's capabilities extended far beyond what her cover identity would suggest. Her responses to unexpected technical problems were too quick and too sophisticated for someone with her supposed level of experience. Her knowledge of communication protocols seemed to include details that should have been restricted to personnel with much higher security clearances. Most tellingly, her situational awareness was far more acute than someone in her position should have possessed, suggesting training and experience that had nothing to do with civilian communications technology. The breakthrough came during a routine training exercise that involved coordinating communications between multiple SEAL teams conducting simultaneous operations in different locations. Maya was assigned to monitor one of the secondary communication channels, a task that should have been relatively simple and straightforward. However, as the exercise progressed, it became clear that the teams were encountering unexpected difficulties that were not part of the planned scenario. Rodriguez was in the communications center monitoring the primary command channel when he heard Maya's voice on the radio circuit she was managing. What caught his attention was not the content of her transmission, but the tone and cadence of her speech. She was speaking to the field teams with the same authoritative confidence he had witnessed during the equipment crisis, but this time, her language included tactical terminology and operational concepts that no civilian contractor should have understood. More significantly, Maya was providing guidance to the SEAL teams that demonstrated intimate knowledge of their capabilities, limitations, and standard operating procedures. She was anticipating their needs before they expressed them, suggesting solutions to tactical problems that revealed understanding of special operations, doctrine that should have been far beyond her security clearance. Her instructions were being followed without question by experienced operators who would normally have challenged guidance from anyone they did not recognize as a qualified authority. Rodriguez began recording Maya's radio transmissions, partly for his own review and partly because he was beginning to suspect that her performance was so far outside the boundaries of her supposed role that it might require official investigation. As he listened to her coordinate the complex training exercise, he realized that she was not simply providing communications support, but was effectively functioning as a tactical coordinator for multiple teams operating in different environments. The most revealing moment came when one of the teams reported that they had encountered an unexpected obstacle that threatened to compromise their training objectives. Maya's immediate response was to suggest a specific tactical solution that demonstrated not only theoretical knowledge of special operations procedures but practical understanding of how those procedures were actually implemented in the field. Her suggestion was so precisely tailored to the situation that it could only have come from someone with extensive experience in similar operations. Rodriguez found himself studying Maya's personnel file with new interest, searching for any clue that might explain the discrepancies he was observing. The file remained as unremarkable as ever, but he began to notice subtle details that had not seemed significant during his initial review. Her security clearance had been processed unusually quickly for a civilian contractor, suggesting either administrative efficiency or influence from higher authorities. Her references, while genuine, came from sources that seemed curiously reluctant to provide detailed information about her background and capabilities. Most intriguingly, Maya's assignment to the base had come through channels that Rodriguez did not recognize, suggesting involvement by agencies or organizations that operated outside the normal military personnel system. When he attempted to contact the office that had processed her paperwork, he discovered that the responsible officials were either unavailable or claimed to have no specific recollection of her case. The overall impression was of someone whose background had been carefully managed to avoid detailed scrutiny. The physical evidence of Maya's true capabilities became impossible to ignore during a crisis that occurred 3 weeks after Rodriguez had begun his informal investigation. A real-world emergency had developed when a SEAL team conducting training exercises in the mountains had encountered severe weather conditions that threatened to turn routine training into a survival situation. The team had lost communication with the base due to equipment failure, and their last known position was in terrain that would make rescue operations extremely difficult. Maya was working alone in the communications center when the emergency developed, and once again Rodriguez witnessed her remarkable transformation from unremarkable support technician to skilled crisis manager. However, this time her capabilities extended far beyond technical competence. She began coordinating rescue operations with the kind of tactical knowledge that suggested intimate familiarity with search and rescue procedures, weather considerations, and the specific capabilities of the teams involved in the operation. Her radio transmissions revealed knowledge of mountain rescue techniques, helicopter insertion procedures, and emergency medical protocols that should have required years of specialized training to master. She was making decisions about resource allocation and tactical priorities that demonstrated understanding of complex operational factors that civilian contractors were not supposed to comprehend. Most remarkably, she was doing so with the calm confidence of someone who had managed similar emergencies many times before. Rodriguez realized that he was witnessing something that went far beyond hidden competence or exceptional natural ability. Maya's performance suggested professional training and operational experience that would have taken years to develop, training that was inconsistent with any civilian background, but perfectly consistent with advanced military or intelligence operations. The woman who claimed to be a simple communications technician was demonstrating capabilities that suggested a very different kind of professional history. The rescue operation was successful, with all team members safely recovered despite challenging weather conditions and difficult terrain. Maya's coordination had been instrumental in ensuring that rescue resources were deployed efficiently and that all safety protocols were followed throughout the operation. Her performance had been so exceptional that it attracted attention from senior officers who normally would never have been aware of a civilian contractor's contributions to base operations. As the immediate crisis passed, Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. Instead of allowing Maya to fade back into her usual anonymity, he approached her directly and asked a question that would shatter her carefully constructed cover identity. The question was simple, but its implications were profound, touching on knowledge and experience that Maya Chen was not supposed to possess. The moment Rodriguez spoke those words, he saw something change in Maya's eyes. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, as if a mask had suddenly slipped to reveal something much more complex and dangerous underneath. For just an instant, he found himself looking at someone who was clearly not the person she had, then pretending to be someone whose true identity would have profound implications for everything he thought he knew about the quiet woman who had been working in his communications center for the past 18 months. Maya's response would prove to be the beginning of a revelation that would change Rodriguez's understanding of military operations, personal sacrifice, and the hidden costs of serving in the shadows where heroism and tragedy intersect in ways that can never be fully understood by those who have never walked that path themselves. Rodriguez had seen that look before, but never in the eyes of a civilian contractor. It was the expression of someone who had been caught in a lie so fundamental that maintaining it had become impossible. Maya's entire posture shifted in that moment, her shoulders straightening as if she had suddenly remembered something about herself that she had been working very hard to forget. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to someone who had spent years learning to read the micro-expressions and body language of people under extreme stress. The question Rodriguez had asked was deceptively simple, but its implications cut straight to the heart of Maya's carefully constructed identity. He had mentioned a specific tactical procedure that had been used during the mountain rescue operation, something that should have been completely outside her area of expertise. Her response had been too quick, too detailed, and too confident for someone whose knowledge was supposed to be limited to communications technology. More importantly, she had used terminology and concepts that were restricted to personnel with specialized training in high-altitude rescue operations. Maya stood frozen for several seconds, her mind clearly racing as she calculated the implications of what had just happened. Rodriguez could see her evaluating options, weighing risks, and making the kind of rapid tactical assessment that suggested experience with situations where a single wrong decision could have catastrophic consequences. The quiet, apologetic woman who had been Maya Chen was still there, but underneath her surface persona, something much more complex and dangerous had awakened. When Maya finally spoke, her voice carried none of the hesitant uncertainty that had characterized her interactions for the past 18 months. Her words were measured and precise, chosen with the kind of careful consideration that suggested she understood exactly how much her response might reveal about her true background. She was no longer the civilian contractor who seemed perpetually surprised by her own competence, but someone who clearly understood the stakes of the conversation that was about to unfold. Rodriguez realized that he was looking at someone who had been trained to handle interrogation, someone who understood that every word and gesture would be analyzed for clues about information she was trying to protect. The transformation was so complete that he began to question whether the Maya Chen he had observed for the past year and a half had ever been real, or whether she had been an elaborate performance designed to hide something much more significant. The revelation began with a single detail that seemed innocuous, but carried profound implications for everything Rodriguez thought he knew about Maya's background. During the mountain rescue operation, she had mentioned a specific piece of equipment that had been discontinued from military inventory several years earlier. The reference had been casual, almost throwaway, but it demonstrated familiarity with specialized gear that civilian contractors would never have encountered. More importantly, her knowledge of the equipment's capabilities and limitations suggested hands-on experience rather than theoretical study. Rodriguez pressed further, asking increasingly specific questions about procedures and protocols that should have been completely outside Maya's area of expertise. Her responses revealed a depth of knowledge that was impossible to explain through any civilian background, no matter how extensive her supposed training might have been. She knew details about equipment specifications, tactical procedures, and operational considerations that could only have been acquired through direct participation in special operations. The most damning evidence came when Rodriguez mentioned a specific incident that had occurred during training exercises several years earlier, before Maya's supposed arrival at the base. Her reaction was immediate and involuntary, a brief flash of recognition that suggested personal familiarity with events that she should never have heard about. The incident had been classified, involving procedures that were restricted to personnel with the highest security clearances. But Maya's response indicated not just knowledge of what had happened, but understanding of why it had happened and what lessons had been learned from the experience. Maya's cover identity began to unravel as Rodriguez systematically challenged the inconsistencies he had observed over the past several weeks. Her supposed educational background could not explain her sophisticated understanding of military communications protocols. Her claimed work experience did not account for her ability to coordinate complex operations involving multiple teams and specialized equipment. Most significantly, her security clearance process had involved background checks that should have revealed any prior military service, but her file showed no evidence of previous involvement with special operations. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez noticed something that Maya had successfully hidden for 18 months, but could no longer conceal under direct scrutiny. As she reached across her desk to retrieve a technical manual, her sleeve rolled up slightly, revealing the edge of a tattoo that had been carefully concealed beneath her uniform. The design was distinctive, featuring elements that Rodriguez recognized as specific to units that operated in the most classified corners of the special operations community. The tattoo was not simply a decorative design, but a complex symbol that conveyed specific information about the wearer's background, training, and operational experience. Rodriguez had seen similar tattoos on personnel who had been involved in operations that were never officially acknowledged, activities that existed in the gray area between military action and covert intelligence work. The level of detail and symbolic complexity suggested someone who had earned the right to wear such markings through actions that could never be publicly recognized. Maya's reaction to Rodriguez's recognition of the tattoo was immediate and definitive. The last remnants of her cover identity fell away as she realized that maintaining her deception had become impossible. Her entire demeanor changed, revealing someone who had been carefully controlling every aspect of her presentation for months, but could no longer sustain the effort required to maintain such an elaborate fiction. The woman who emerged from behind. Maya Chen's carefully constructed persona was someone Rodriguez had never encountered before, but whose reputation preceded her in the form of whispered stories and classified reports that most personnel were never authorized to read. She was known by a code name that carried legendary status within certain circles of the special operations community, someone whose exploits had become the subject of speculation and mythology among those who understood the true nature of America's most sensitive military operations. Rodriguez found himself looking at someone who had been declared officially dead 3 years earlier, following a mission that had gone catastrophically wrong in circumstances that were still classified at the highest levels of government. The woman standing before him was supposed to be a casualty of an operation that had never officially occurred, someone whose sacrifice had been quietly honored in memorial services that were attended only by personnel who had signed documents, promising never to reveal what they had witnessed. The revelation of Maya's true identity explained everything that Rodriguez had observed over the past several weeks, but it also raised questions that were far more complex and dangerous than simple matters of false documentation or security clearance fraud. If Maya Chen was actually the person Rodriguez suspected her to be, then her presence at the base represented something far more significant than an elaborate attempt to hide from bureaucratic consequences or personal embarrassment. The code name that Rodriguez whispered as recognition dawned was one that had been retired from active use following the catastrophic mission that had supposedly claimed its owner's life. The woman who had carried that designation had been involved in operations that existed at the intersection of military action and intelligence work, activities that were so sensitive that their very existence was denied by official sources. Her presence at the base, alive and apparently healthy, suggested that official reports of her death had been deliberately falsified to protect classified operations. Maya's response to Rodriguez's recognition was neither confirmation nor denial, but rather a careful silence that spoke volumes about the complexity of her situation. She was clearly evaluating the implications of her exposure, calculating risks and considering options with the kind of systematic analysis that suggested extensive experience with situations where discovery could have life-threatening consequences. Her silence was not the result of uncertainty or fear, but of professional caution exercised by someone who understood the stakes involved in revealing classified information. The tattoo that had betrayed Maya's secret was more than just a symbol of unit affiliation or operational experience. Rodriguez recognized it as a memorial, a way of honoring teammates who had died in circumstances that could never be officially acknowledged. The specific design elements corresponded to details from classified reports that Rodriguez had read years earlier. Reports that had described a mission that had ended in disaster for reasons that were still being investigated at the highest levels of the intelligence community. The implications of Maya's survival were staggering. If she was indeed the person Rodriguez suspected, then her death had been officially reported to families, friends, and colleagues who had mourned her loss and moved on with their lives. Her continued existence raised questions about the accuracy of official reports, the reliability of intelligence assessments, and the possibility that other personnel believed dead might also have survived but been unable to return to their previous lives. Rodriguez realized that he was facing a situation that extended far beyond simple matters of personnel security or background verification. Maya's presence at the base represented a potential intelligence crisis that could have implications for ongoing operations, the security of classified information, and the safety of personnel who might be operating under assumptions that had been proven false by her survival. The woman he had known as a quiet communications technician was actually a walking contradiction of official military records and intelligence assessments. The conversation that followed Maya's exposure was unlike anything Rodriguez had experienced in his years of military service. She spoke with the kind of precise, measured cadence that suggested extensive training in information security and operational security procedures. Every word was carefully chosen to reveal exactly the amount of information necessary to establish her credibility while protecting details that could compromise ongoing operations or endanger personnel who might still be operating undercover. Maya's account of her transformation from her original identity to Maya Chen was a masterclass in tradecraft and operational security. She had spent months planning her new identity, establishing documentation, creating a believable background, and developing the skills necessary to maintain her cover under scrutiny. The process had required resources, connections, and expertise that suggested support from organizations that operated outside normal military channels. The most remarkable aspect of Maya's cover identity was not its sophistication, but the psychological discipline required to maintain it for such an extended period. She had spent 18 months suppressing her natural instincts, skills, and knowledge to present herself as someone with completely different capabilities and limitations. The effort required to maintain such a fundamental deception while working in an environment surrounded by people who might recognize inconsistencies was almost beyond comprehension. Rodriguez began to understand that Maya's presence at the base was not simply a matter of someone seeking to escape their past or avoid consequences for previous actions. Her cover identity had been constructed with such care and attention to detail that it suggested a specific purpose, a mission that required her to be in exactly the position she had occupied for the past 18 months. The quiet communications technician who had seemed so unremarkable was actually someone who had been gathering intelligence, monitoring operations, or pursuing objectives that could only be accomplished from within the special operations community. The realization that Maya had been conducting some form of covert operation while maintaining her cover identity raised questions about the scope of her activities and the organizations that might have been directing her actions. Her technical skills, operational knowledge, and access to classified information had given her opportunities to accomplish objectives that would have been impossible for someone without her unique combination of capabilities and positioning. Maya's explanation of her activities over the past 18 months revealed a complex web of intelligence gathering, operational assessment, and strategic planning that had been invisible to everyone around her. She had been using her position to monitor the effectiveness of base security procedures, assess the capabilities of personnel and equipment, and gather information about operational patterns that could be valuable to organizations engaged in similar activities. The scope of Maya's intelligence collection was staggering. She had systematically documented security vulnerabilities, personnel capabilities, equipment specifications, and operational procedures that could provide valuable insights to anyone seeking to understand or counter special operations activities. Her access to communication systems had given her opportunities to monitor message traffic, analyze operational patterns, and gather intelligence about planned activities that would have been impossible to obtain through any other means. Rodriguez found himself confronting the possibility that Maya's activities represented a security breach of unprecedented scope and sophistication. Her position had given her access to information that could compromise ongoing operations, endanger personnel, and provide hostile organizations with detailed intelligence about special operations capabilities and procedures. The woman he had known as a quiet support technician had actually been conducting what amounted to a comprehensive intelligence operation against the very organization that had employed her. The most disturbing aspect of Maya's revelation was not what she had been doing, but why she had been doing it. Her motivations were complex and deeply personal, rooted in events that had occurred during the classified mission that had supposedly claimed her life. The operation that had ended in disaster had been compromised by intelligence failures, operational security breaches, and decisions that had prioritized political considerations over the safety of personnel in the field. Maya's survival had come at a cost that extended far beyond physical injury or psychological trauma. She had lost teammates, friends, and colleagues who had died because of failures in planning, intelligence, and operational security that could have been prevented with better information and more careful analysis. Her subsequent activities had been driven by a desire to understand how such failures could be prevented in the future, even if it required her to operate outside official channels and established procedures. The intelligence that Maya had gathered during her time at the base was not intended for hostile organizations or foreign governments, but rather for elements within the special operations community who were working to address the systemic problems that had contributed to the disaster that had supposedly claimed her life. Her activities represented an attempt to improve security, enhance operational effectiveness, and prevent future tragedies through better understanding of current capabilities and limitations. Rodriguez began to understand that Maya's deception had been motivated not by personal gain or hostile intent, but by a deep sense of responsibility to the personnel who continued to risk their lives in operations that might be compromised by the same kinds of failures that had led to the disaster. She had survived. Her willingness to sacrifice her identity, her career, and her personal relationships had been driven by a conviction that the information she could gather might prevent other teams from experiencing the losses she had witnessed. The revelation of Maya's true identity and motivations transformed Rodriguez's understanding of everything he had observed over the past several weeks. Her exceptional performance during crisis situations had not been the result of hidden talent or exceptional training, but rather the natural expression of someone whose real capabilities had been suppressed by the demands of maintaining an elaborate cover identity. The quiet, unremarkable woman who had seemed so out of place among elite warriors was actually someone who belonged in that environment more than most of the personnel who had dismissed her as irrelevant. Maya's tactical knowledge, operational experience, and crisis management skills had been earned through participation in missions that existed at the highest levels of military and intelligence operations. Her understanding of communication protocols, rescue procedures, and security considerations had been developed through direct involvement in activities that were so classified that their very existence was denied by official sources. The woman who had pretended to be a simple support technician, was actually someone whose experience and expertise exceeded that of most of the personnel she had been serving. The psychological toll of maintaining such an elaborate deception for 18 months was evident in Maya's demeanor as she finally revealed her true identity. The effort required to suppress her natural instincts and capabilities, while working in an environment where her expertise could have been valuable, had created a tension that was visible in her posture, her voice, and her facial expressions. She had been forced to watch procedures that could have been improved, respond to crises with less than her full capabilities, and maintain relationships based on false premises about her background and qualifications. Rodriguez realized that Maya's exposure represented both a crisis and an opportunity. Her presence at the base had created a security situation that would require investigation and resolution by authorities far above his level of command. However, her intelligence gathering and operational assessment might also provide valuable insights that could improve security, enhance effectiveness, and prevent future tragedies of the kind that had supposedly claimed her life. The question of what would happen to Maya following her exposure was complex and fraught with implications that extended far beyond simple matters of personnel, management, or security procedures. Her continued existence contradicted official reports. Her activities had involved potential security violations, and her knowledge of classified operations made her both a valuable asset and a potential liability for organizations that preferred to operate in the shadows. Maya's fate would ultimately be determined by authorities who operated at levels of classification and security that Rodriguez could barely comprehend. Her survival, her activities, and her knowledge represented challenges that would require careful consideration by people who understood the full implications of her situation. The woman who had successfully hidden her identity for 18 months was about to discover whether her sacrifice had been worthwhile, and whether the system she had been trying to protect would ultimately protect her in return. The revelation of Maya's true identity marked the end of one chapter in her extraordinary story, but the beginning of another that would test her resolve, her capabilities, and her commitment to the values that had driven her to sacrifice everything in pursuit of a mission that only she fully understood. The quiet support technician who had seemed so unremarkable was about to face consequences that would determine whether her gamble had been worth the cost she had already paid. The secure conference room at Naval Special Warfare Command was silent except for the quiet hum of electronic equipment and the soft rustle of classified documents being reviewed by men whose faces betrayed nothing of their thoughts. Maya sat at the polished table, her hands folded calmly in her lap, surrounded by officers whose combined experience represented decades of the most sensitive operations in American military history. The woman who had spent 18 months pretending to be a simple communications technician now faced a tribunal that would determine whether her deception had been an act of betrayal or an extraordinary display of dedication to duty. Admiral James Hartwell, the gray-haired commander whose weathered face bore the marks of a career spent in the shadows of national security, studied Maya with the kind of penetrating gaze that had evaluated countless personnel decisions involving life and death consequences. He had read every classified report about the mission that had supposedly claimed her life, reviewed every intelligence assessment about the security failures that had led to disaster, and examined every piece of evidence that might explain how someone officially declared dead had managed to resurface in the heart of the special operations community. The evidence spread across the conference table told a story that challenged fundamental assumptions about operational security, personnel management, and the reliability of official reports. Maya's survival had been documented through medical records, witness statements, and physical evidence that contradicted every official account of the mission that had ended her previous life. Her transformation into Maya Chen had been accomplished through a combination of professional tradecraft, extensive planning, and resources that suggested support from organizations that operated outside normal military channels. Captain Sarah Morrison, the intelligence officer whose responsibility included monitoring threats to operational security, had spent weeks analyzing Maya's activities during her time at the base. Her report documented a systematic intelligence collection effort that had gathered information about security procedures, personnel capabilities, and operational patterns with a thoroughness that would have impressed professional intelligence officers. However, the analysis had also revealed that Maya's activities had been focused on identifying vulnerabilities and improving security rather than compromising operations or endangering personnel. The most significant discovery had come from Maya's personal effects, which included detailed documentation of security weaknesses, operational inefficiencies, and personnel issues that had been compiled with the obvious intention of providing recommendations for improvement. Her work represented months of careful observation, analysis, and assessment that had produced insights valuable to anyone seeking to enhance the effectiveness and security of special operations activities. Maya's explanation of her activities was delivered with the same calm professionalism that had characterized her crisis management during her time as a communications technician. She spoke without notes, without hesitation, and without any apparent concern for the consequences of her revelations. Her account revealed a complex web of relationships, obligations, and motivations that had driven her to sacrifice her identity and career in pursuit of objectives that she considered more important than her personal safety or professional advancement. The mission that had supposedly claimed Maya's life had been compromised by intelligence failures that had cost the lives of teammates, whose deaths could have been prevented with better information and more careful planning. Her survival had been possible only because of actions taken by personnel who had violated official orders to attempt a rescue that had been officially prohibited. The men and women who had died in that operation had been betrayed by systemic failures that Maya had become determined to address through any means necessary. Maya's transformation into a civilian contractor had been accomplished through the assistance of former colleagues who shared her conviction that the problems responsible for the disaster needed to be addressed through unofficial channels. Her cover identity had been created by people who understood the importance of her mission and were willing to risk their careers to provide her with the resources and support necessary to accomplish her objectives. The intelligence that Maya had gathered during her 18 months at the base had been systematically shared with a network of current and former special operations personnel who were working to identify and address security vulnerabilities, operational inefficiencies, and personnel issues that could lead to future tragedies. Her activities had been coordinated with people who occupied positions throughout the special operations community, creating a shadow organization dedicated to improving security and effectiveness through methods that were not available through official channels. Admiral Hartwell recognized the names of several personnel who had been involved in supporting Maya's activities. These were men and women whose service records represented the highest levels of dedication, competence, and integrity within the special operations community. Their willingness to risk their careers to support Maya's mission provided powerful evidence that her activities had been motivated by legitimate concerns about security and effectiveness rather than personal grievances or hostile intentions. The revelation that Maya's deception had been supported by a network of respected professionals throughout the special operations community transformed the nature of the investigation from a simple matter of security violations to a complex assessment of systemic problems that had driven experienced personnel to operate outside official channels. Her activities represented not just individual initiative, but collective action by people who believed that official procedures were inadequate to address serious security concerns. Captain Morrison's analysis had identified specific recommendations that had emerged from Maya's intelligence gathering, recommendations that addressed security vulnerabilities, operational procedures, and personnel policies that could be improved. to enhance effectiveness and prevent future tragedies. The quality and sophistication of these recommendations demonstrated that Maya's activities had been focused on constructive objectives rather than destructive ones. The most compelling evidence of Maya's legitimate motivations came from intercepted communications that had been discovered during the investigation of her activities. These communications revealed that she had been in contact with families of personnel who had died in the mission that had supposedly claimed her life. Rather than seeking personal recognition or attempting to correct official records, Maya had been working to ensure that the families understood the true circumstances of their loved ones' deaths and received support that was not available through official channels. Maya's contact with these families had been conducted with extraordinary care to protect their privacy and emotional well-being, while providing them with information about the circumstances of their losses that official reports had been unable to reveal. Her efforts had been focused on ensuring that the sacrifices of her former teammates were properly understood and honored, even if such recognition could never be made public due to the classified nature of their activities. The investigation had also revealed that Maya had been instrumental in preventing several security incidents that could have compromised ongoing operations or endangered personnel. Her position as a communications technician had given her access to information about potential threats and vulnerabilities that she had quietly addressed through unofficial channels. Her interventions had been so subtle and effective that their impact had been largely invisible to official oversight, but their importance had been documented through careful analysis of incident reports and security assessments. Admiral Hartwell found himself confronting a situation that challenged traditional concepts of loyalty, duty, and proper procedures. Maya's activities had clearly violated official protocols and security procedures, but they had been motivated by dedication to principles that represented the highest ideals of military service. Her willingness to sacrifice her identity, career, and personal relationships in pursuit of objectives that she considered more important than her individual welfare represented a form of service that transcended normal expectations of duty and obligation. The question of what should be done with Maya was complicated by the fact that her continued existence contradicted official reports that had been provided to families, colleagues, and government officials. Her survival raised questions about the accuracy of intelligence assessments, the reliability of official procedures, and the effectiveness of systems that were supposed to prevent the kinds of failures that had led to the disaster she had survived. The decision that emerged from hours of deliberation reflected the complex nature of Maya's situation and the unprecedented circumstances that had led to her exposure. Rather than treating her activities as security violations that required punishment, the tribunal recognized that her intelligence gathering and analysis had provided valuable insights that could improve security and effectiveness throughout the special operations community. Maya would be officially reinstated to active duty with a new identity that would allow her to continue her work while providing her with the legal protections and official support that had been lacking during her time as a civilian contractor. Her activities would be formalized through assignment to a newly created position that would allow her to pursue the same objectives that had motivated her deception, but with official authorization and appropriate resources. The network of personnel who had supported Maya's activities would be formally recognized and incorporated into an expanded program designed to identify and address security vulnerabilities, operational inefficiencies, and personnel issues that could not be adequately addressed through normal channels. Their unofficial efforts would be transformed into an official capability that would provide the special operations community with enhanced security and effectiveness. The families of personnel who had died in the mission that had supposedly claimed Maya's life would receive additional support and information that would help them understand the true circumstances of their losses without compromising ongoing security requirements. Maya's efforts to honor the memory of her former teammates would be continued through official channels that could provide more comprehensive assistance while protecting the privacy and emotional well-being of those who had suffered losses. Maya's response to the tribunal's decision was characteristic of the quiet professionalism that had defined her service throughout her career. She expressed gratitude for the opportunity to continue her work through official channels, but her primary concern remained focused on ensuring that the systemic problems that had led to the deaths of her teammates would be addressed effectively. Her willingness to accept any assignment that would advance those objectives demonstrated that her motivations had remained unchanged despite the dramatic transformation of her circumstances. The ceremony that marked Maya's official return to active duty was conducted in the same secure conference room where her fate had been decided, attended only by the personnel who had been directly involved in the investigation and decision-making process. The woman who had spent 18 months hiding her identity was presented with new credentials, a new assignment, and the formal recognition that her service had earned despite the unconventional methods she had employed to accomplish her objectives. Admiral Hartwell's presentation of Maya's new assignment included a personal commendation that acknowledged the extraordinary dedication and sacrifice that had characterized her service, her willingness to risk everything in pursuit of objectives that served the greater good of the special operations community, represented the highest ideals of military service, even when those ideals had required her to operate outside official channels and establish procedures. The security briefing that followed Maya's reinstatement outlined the scope of her new responsibilities and the resources that would be available to support her continued efforts to improve security and effectiveness throughout the special operations community. Her unique combination of operational experience, technical expertise, and analytical capabilities made her ideally suited to address the complex challenges that had motivated her original deception. Maya's first official assignment would involve conducting a comprehensive assessment of security procedures and operational protocols that could be improved based on the intelligence she had gathered during her time as a civilian contractor. Her recommendations would be implemented through official channels that could provide the resources and authority necessary to address systemic problems that had previously been beyond the reach of normal administrative procedures. The transformation of Maya's unauthorized activities into an official program represented a recognition that the special operations community needed enhanced capabilities to identify and address security vulnerabilities, operational inefficiencies, and personnel issues that could not be adequately handled through traditional methods. Her pioneering efforts had demonstrated the value of such capabilities and provided a foundation for their formal development and implementation. Maya's return to her quarters that evening marked the end of a deception that had lasted 18 months and the beginning of a new chapter in her service that would allow her to pursue the same objectives that had motivated her sacrifice, but with official support and recognition. The woman who had hidden her identity to serve what she considered higher purposes had been vindicated by a system that had ultimately recognized the value of her contributions and the legitimacy of her motivations. The quiet dignity with which Maya had conducted herself throughout the investigation and tribunal proceedings reflected the character that had enabled her to maintain her deception while serving objectives that transcended personal interests. Her willingness to sacrifice her identity and career for the greater good of the special operations community had been recognized and rewarded through assignment to a position that would allow her to continue her work with official authorization and support. Maya's story would never be told publicly due to the classified nature of her activities and the security requirements that surrounded her work. However, her example would continue to inspire personnel throughout the special operations community, who understood that true service sometimes required actions that went beyond normal expectations of duty and obligation. The woman who had pretended to be unremarkable had proven herself to be extraordinary in ways that would influence military service for years to come. The impact of Maya's revelations and recommendations would be felt throughout the special operations community as security procedures were enhanced, operational protocols were improved, and personnel policies were modified to address the systemic problems that had motivated her original deception. Her intelligence gathering and analysis had provided insights that would help prevent future tragedies while honoring the memory of those who had already made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country. Maya's final entry in her personal journal that night reflected on the journey that had led from the disaster that had supposedly claimed her life to the recognition that had restored her identity and purpose. Her words revealed someone who had found peace through service to objectives greater than herself, someone who had discovered that true heroism often required the willingness to remain invisible while accomplishing missions that could never be publicly acknowledged or celebrated. The weeks following Maya's official reinstatement brought a transformation that extended far beyond her personal circumstances. The special operations community, typically resistant to change and suspicious of outsiders, began to embrace reforms that had emerged from her careful analysis and recommendations. Her insights, gathered through 18 months of patient observation and meticulous documentation, provided a roadmap for addressing systemic vulnerabilities that had previously been invisible to official oversight. Commander Rodriguez found himself appointed as Maya's official liaison, a position that required him to coordinate between her analytical work and the implementation of security improvements across multiple units. His initial skepticism about her unconventional methods had evolved into profound respect for the depth of her understanding and the practical value of her recommendations. The woman who had once seemed like a misplaced civilian contractor had become an indispensable resource for improving operational effectiveness and personnel security. Maya's new office was located in a secure facility that had been specifically designed to accommodate the sensitive nature of her work. The space reflected both the importance of her mission and the need for absolute confidentiality in her activities. Advanced communication equipment allowed her to maintain contact with personnel throughout the special operations community, while sophisticated analytical tools enabled her to process intelligence and develop recommendations with unprecedented precision and thoroughness. The first major test of Maya's new role came when intelligence reports indicated potential security compromises in several ongoing operations. Her analysis revealed patterns that had been missed by conventional assessment methods, identifying vulnerabilities that could have led to catastrophic failures similar to the disaster that had supposedly claimed her life. Her recommendations resulted in operational modifications that successfully prevented compromise while maintaining mission effectiveness. Captain Morrison, now serving as Maya's administrative supervisor, observed the transformation with a combination of admiration and concern. Maya's dedication to her work bordered on obsession, driven by memories of teammates who had died because of preventable failures. Her willingness to work 18-hour days and her insistence on personally reviewing every detail of security assessments reflected a level of commitment that was both inspiring and unsustainable. The psychological toll of Maya's deception was becoming apparent as she adjusted to her new circumstances. 18 months of suppressing her natural instincts and capabilities had created patterns of behavior that were difficult to break. She found herself automatically deferring to colleagues who had less experience and knowledge, apologizing for contributions that were clearly valuable, and struggling to project the confidence that her new position required. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the clinical psychologist assigned to support Maya's transition, recognized the signs of someone who had been psychologically conditioned to hide their true capabilities. The process of rebuilding Maya's professional identity would require addressing not just the practical aspects of her new role, but the deeper psychological effects of prolonged deception and the trauma associated with the losses that had motivated her original sacrifice. Maya's sessions with Dr. Warren revealed the extent to which her deception had affected her sense of self and professional identity. The woman who had once commanded respect and authority in the most challenging operational environments had learned to present herself as someone whose contributions were barely adequate. Reversing this conditioning required careful attention to both conscious behaviors and unconscious patterns that had developed during her time undercover. The intelligence network that had supported Maya's activities during her deception was formally incorporated into the new security assessment program, creating an unofficial but effective communication system that provided real-time information about potential threats and vulnerabilities. The men and women who had risked their careers to support her mission found themselves recognized as pioneers in a new approach to security that emphasized proactive identification and prevention rather than reactive response. Master Sergeant David Kim, one of Maya's most trusted contacts during her time as a civilian contractor, was appointed as her senior enlisted advisor. His experience in the field provided practical perspective on the implementation of her recommendations, while his understanding of personnel dynamics helped ensure that security improvements would be accepted and effectively utilized by the personnel they were designed to protect. The families of personnel who had died in the mission that had supposedly claimed Maya's life received visits from specially trained counselors who provided additional information about the circumstances of their losses without compromising ongoing security requirements. Maya's personal involvement in these efforts was limited by security considerations, but her influence was evident in the care and attention given to ensuring that families understood the true nature of their loved ones. Service and sacrifice. The memorial service for Maya's former teammates was conducted with the full honors that had been denied at the time of their deaths due to the classified nature of their mission. Maya stood among the mourners, no longer hidden behind a false identity, finally able to openly grieve for friends and colleagues whose losses had driven her to sacrifice her own identity in pursuit of preventing similar tragedies. The ceremony was attended by personnel from throughout the special operations community, many of whom had only recently learned of the true circumstances surrounding the mission that had ended in disaster. The presence of Maya, officially returned from the dead, served as a powerful reminder that the costs of operational security failures extended far beyond statistical casualties to include the destruction of lives, careers, and relationships that could never be fully restored. General Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer responsible for Special Operations Policy, used the memorial service as an opportunity to announce comprehensive reforms that had emerged from Maya's analysis and recommendations. The changes represented the most significant modification of security procedures and operational protocols in decades, touching every aspect of special operations from initial planning through post-mission analysis. The implementation of Maya's recommendations required extensive coordination between multiple agencies and organizations that had traditionally operated independently. Her role as a central coordinator provided the continuity and expertise necessary to ensure that security improvements were implemented consistently and effectively across all relevant units and commands. Maya's daily routine in her new position involved reviewing intelligence reports, analyzing security assessments, and developing recommendations for addressing identified vulnerabilities. Her work required maintaining constant awareness of ongoing operations while identifying patterns and trends that might indicate systemic problems requiring attention. The complexity of her responsibilities demanded the same level of dedication and attention to detail that had characterized her previous deception. The first major crisis that tested Maya's new role came when a training accident resulted in serious injuries to several personnel. Her analysis revealed that the accident had been caused by equipment failures that should have been identified through routine maintenance procedures. Her investigation uncovered systematic inadequacies in equipment inspection protocols that had created risks throughout the special operations community. Maya's report on the training accident led to immediate changes in equipment maintenance procedures and inspection protocols that addressed not just the specific failures that had caused the accident, but broader systemic issues that could have led to similar problems in operational environments. Her recommendations saved lives and prevented injuries that would have been far more serious if the same failures had occurred during actual missions. The success of Maya's analysis and recommendations in preventing future accidents established her credibility throughout the special operations community and demonstrated the practical value of her approach to security assessment. Personnel who had initially been skeptical of her methods began to actively seek her input on security matters, recognizing that her insights could prevent problems before they became crises. Maya's relationship with the families of her former teammates evolved as security restrictions were relaxed and she was able to provide more comprehensive information about their loved ones' service and sacrifice. Her personal involvement in ensuring that these families received appropriate support and recognition reflected her continued commitment to honoring the memory of those who had died in the mission that had supposedly claimed her life. The anniversary of the mission that had ended in disaster was marked by a private ceremony attended by Maya, surviving family members, and personnel who had been involved in the subsequent investigation and reforms. The gathering provided an opportunity for closure and recognition that had been impossible when the mission's existence was completely classified and its casualties could not be publicly acknowledged. Maya's address to the gathering was her first public acknowledgement of the events that had led to her deception and her subsequent efforts to prevent similar tragedies. Her words reflected both the pain of loss and the satisfaction of knowing that her sacrifice had contributed to changes that would protect future generations of special operations personnel. The expansion of Maya's program to include personnel from allied nations reflected the international scope of modern special operations and the need for security improvements that transcended national boundaries. Her work with foreign counterparts required careful navigation of diplomatic considerations while maintaining the security requirements that protected sensitive information and operational capabilities. Colonel James Patterson, the officer responsible for international coordination, recognized Maya's unique qualifications for working with allied personnel. Her operational experience, analytical capabilities, and understanding of security requirements made her an ideal representative for sharing insights and recommendations that could benefit the broader international special operations community. Maya's contributions to international security cooperation extended beyond simple information sharing to include development of standardized procedures and protocols that could be adopted by allied nations. Her work helped establish common standards for security assessment and vulnerability identification that improved the safety and effectiveness of joint operations. The recognition that Maya received from allied nations included honors and commendations that acknowledged her contributions to international security cooperation. These awards represented official acknowledgement of her service that had been impossible during her time undercover, providing validation that her sacrifice had been worthwhile and her contributions had been valued. Maya's personal life began to stabilize as she adjusted to her new circumstances and established routines that reflected her official identity rather than her elaborate deception. The apartment that had served as her cover residence was replaced by housing that was more appropriate for someone of her actual rank and responsibilities, though she chose to maintain the same modest lifestyle that had characterized her time as a civilian contractor. The relationships that Maya had maintained during her deception required careful handling as she revealed her true identity to friends and colleagues who had known her as Maya Chen. The process of rebuilding these relationships on a foundation of truth rather than deception was complicated by the need to maintain security restrictions while providing enough information to explain her transformation. Dr. Warren's assessment of Maya's psychological adjustment indicated steady progress in recovering from the effects of prolonged deception and the trauma associated with the losses that had motivated her original sacrifice. Maya's ability to function effectively in her new role while maintaining her personal stability demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. The legacy of Maya's deception extended far beyond the specific security improvements that had emerged from her analysis and recommendations. Her willingness to sacrifice her identity and career for the greater good of the special operations community had inspired others to consider their own responsibilities for preventing tragedies and protecting their colleagues. The training programs that incorporated Maya's insights and recommendations became standard throughout the special operations community, ensuring that future generations of personnel would benefit from the lessons learned through her sacrifice. Her contributions to security procedures and operational protocols would continue to protect lives and prevent tragedies long after her active service had ended. Maya's final report on the implementation of her recommendations documented the comprehensive changes that had emerged from her 18 months of careful observation and analysis. The report served as both a conclusion to her extraordinary deception and a foundation for continued efforts to improve security and effectiveness throughout the special operations community. The quiet satisfaction that Maya found in her new role reflected her understanding that her sacrifice had been worthwhile and her contributions had made a meaningful difference in the lives of personnel who would benefit from improved security procedures and operational protocols. Her transformation from a woman who had supposedly died in service to her country to someone who had found new purpose in protecting others represented a form of resurrection that transcended simple survival. The memorial that was established in honor of Maya's former teammates included recognition of her own contributions to preventing future tragedies and protecting the lives of personnel who continued to serve in the most dangerous corners of the special operations community. Her name, finally restored to official records, stood alongside those of her colleagues who had made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country. Maya's story, though never told publicly due to security restrictions, became legend within the special operations community. Her example of dedication, sacrifice, and service inspired others to consider their own responsibilities for protecting their colleagues and preventing tragedies that could be avoided through better understanding and preparation. The woman who had hidden her identity to serve what she considered higher purposes had found recognition and validation that her sacrifice had been worthwhile. Maya's transformation from a supposedly dead hero to a living example of service and dedication represented the best traditions of the special operations community and the highest ideals of military service. The impact of Maya's contributions would continue to be felt throughout the special operations community for years to come, as the security improvements and operational modifications that had emerged from her analysis and recommendations protected lives and prevented tragedies that might otherwise have occurred. Her legacy would live on in the lives that were saved and the families that were spared the losses that had motivated her original sacrifice. Maya's final journal entry reflected on the journey that had led from the disaster that had supposedly claimed her life to the recognition and validation that had restored her identity and purpose. Her words revealed someone who had found peace through service to objectives greater than herself, someone who had discovered that true heroism often required the willingness to sacrifice everything for the protection of others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.